My father called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice carrying a strange, clipped formality I'd never heard him use with me before, informing me that the family had finalized the sale of Fontaine Technologies for $80 billion, and that going forward, my presence at family gatherings and any involvement with the company's legacy would no longer be considered appropriate. I sat there in my small research lab, phone pressed against my ear, genuinely stunned, processing the specific devastating reality that my own family had apparently negotiated and closed the single largest transaction in our entire company's history without ever once including me, the person who had actually invented the core technology that made the entire company worth anything at all. Stick with me, because my father genuinely believed, ending that call, that he'd successfully removed the one inconvenient variable standing between his family and an enormous payday. He had no idea exactly how thoroughly that specific oversight was about to unravel everything. My name is Zadie Fontaine. I'm 31 years old, and my father, Aldrich Fontaine, along with my older brother Thatcher, had apparently spent the preceding 8 months quietly negotiating the sale of Fontaine Technologies, the company I'd helped build from a small research startup into a genuinely revolutionary force within the semiconductor industry, developing the core processing architecture that had made our proprietary chips considerably faster and more energy efficient than anything else currently available. Throughout the broader market, what my father and brother apparently either forgot or deliberately chose to ignore throughout their entire negotiation process was that the specific patents underlying our most valuable technology remained registered entirely in my own name, filed years earlier during my doctoral research, licensed to Fontaine Technologies through an agreement I'd personally negotiated and could, under specific circumstances outlined within that original licensing contract, potentially revoke entirely. That devastating phone call, delivered with such casual, dismissive finality, represented simply the latest and most extreme expression of a pattern that had shaped my entire relationship with my father and brother throughout years of building this company together, one where my actual technical contributions had always somehow mattered less than Thatcher's more visible business-focused leadership role. I joined Fontaine Technologies immediately after completing my doctorate in electrical engineering, bringing with me the core processing architecture I'd spent years developing throughout my graduate research, technology that would eventually become the genuine foundation underlying nearly every significant product our company ever successfully brought to market. My father, who had founded the company decades earlier around considerably more modest technology, had welcomed my arrival enthusiastically at first, genuinely excited about the transformative potential my research represented for our company's future. Thatcher, 3 years older than me, had already established himself as the company's chief operating officer by that point, managing business development and investor relations while I focused entirely on continued technical innovation within our research division. Throughout the following 8 years, I'd continued developing increasingly sophisticated iterations of that original architecture, each new patent filed carefully under my own name before being formally licensed to Fontaine Technologies, an arrangement my father had initially framed as simply reflecting standard industry practice regarding individual inventor recognition, though I recognize now, with considerable hindsight, that maintaining this specific structure may have unconsciously reflected some genuine, if unacknowledged, distinction he and Thatcher drew between my technical contributions and their own more visible leadership roles. I genuinely believed, throughout those 8 years of dedicated work, that my family valued my contributions as equally significant to Thatcher's business leadership, an assumption that devastating phone call would ultimately reveal as considerably more naive than I'd ever wanted to acknowledge throughout those years of building something I genuinely believed represented a shared family accomplishment. I learned, through careful investigation following that devastating call, that my father and Thatcher had begun quiet negotiations with a major technology conglomerate roughly 8 months earlier, discussions they'd apparently deliberately kept hidden from me throughout that entire extended process, understanding, I would eventually recognize, that my direct involvement might have complicated their preferred approach to structuring the eventual sale. I discovered that Thatcher had specifically argued, during internal family discussions I only learned about secondhand through a sympathetic company attorney, that my continued presence within the company represented an unnecessary complication given how personally attached I'd always remained to the technology itself, suggesting that a clean sale would proceed more smoothly if I remained entirely uninvolved throughout the negotiation process. My father had apparently agreed to this specific framing, genuinely convincing himself, I would later understand through a difficult subsequent conversation, that excluding me represented a reasonable business decision rather than any genuine betrayal of my actual role in building the technology that made this entire $80 billion transaction possible in the first place. I sat with this discovery for several genuinely difficult days, processing both the practical business implications and the deeper, more painful recognition that my own family had apparently decided, at some point throughout that extended process, that my actual presence and voice mattered less than simply completing their preferred transaction efficiently. I consulted directly with my own intellectual property attorney, Corinne Ashby, walking her carefully through the specific licensing agreement I'd negotiated years earlier, an agreement that included a specific clause allowing me to revoke Fontaine Technologies' licensing rights under circumstances involving fundamental changes to the company's ownership structure, without my direct consultation and agreement. Corinne reviewed that agreement carefully, confirming what I genuinely hoped but hadn't been entirely certain remained legally enforceable given how many years had passed since its original negotiation. "This clause is remarkably clear," she told me. "Given that your father and brother proceeded with this sale without any consultation whatsoever, you likely have legitimate grounds to revoke the licensing agreement entirely, which would mean the acquiring company would be purchasing a business without legal rights to its own core technology." I processed this information carefully, understanding the genuinely significant power this specific legal reality now provided me, power my father and brother had apparently never fully considered throughout their entire extended negotiation process, having perhaps convinced themselves that my continued licensing agreement represented simply a formality rather than a genuine, enforceable legal requirement. I decided, working carefully with Corinne, exactly how I intended to use this unexpected leverage, understanding that whatever action I ultimately chose needed to reflect both genuine accountability for my family's calculated exclusion and my own broader interests regarding the technology I'd spent years genuinely dedicating my career toward developing. I formally notified Fontaine Technologies' legal department, along with the acquiring conglomerate's own attorneys, that I intended to exercise my contractual right to revoke the patent licensing agreement given the fundamental ownership change that had occurred entirely without my consultation or consent, a notice that triggered immediate, significant alarm throughout both organizations given the transaction's already advanced stage. The acquiring conglomerate's attorneys contacted my own legal team within hours of receiving that formal notice, requesting an urgent meeting to understand exactly what this specific complication might mean for their already substantially completed $80 billion acquisition, a meeting that revealed with genuine clarity exactly how significant my retained patent rights actually represented to the entire deal's underlying value. My father called me directly that same evening, his earlier clipped formality entirely replaced by genuine, visible panic. "What exactly are you doing?" he demanded. "This could unravel the entire sale. Do you understand what kind of position you're putting this family in?" "I understand exactly what position you put me in first," I told him, my voice carrying a calm that clearly unsettled him considerably more than any angry response might have generated. "You sold a company built on my technology without ever once including me in that decision. Now you're going to understand exactly how significant my actual contribution to this company always was." My father and Thatcher requested an emergency family meeting the following day, arriving at my apartment with an urgency that felt, given everything that had transpired, genuinely remarkable compared to their earlier dismissive treatment throughout the entire sale process. "We need to figure this out," Thatcher said, his voice carrying considerably less confidence than his usual business demeanor typically projected. "The buyers are threatening to walk away entirely if this patent situation isn't resolved quickly. This affects the whole family, Zadie, not just you. It affected the whole family when you two decided to exclude me from a transaction involving technology one personally invented," I reminded him. "You didn't seem particularly concerned about how that affected me at the time." My father attempted a more conciliatory approach, though his underlying frustration remained clearly visible throughout his careful word choices. "We made a mistake not including you in the negotiations," he acknowledged. "But threatening to unravel the entire sale feels like an extreme response that could hurt everyone, including you, given your own financial stake in the company." I listened to their concerns carefully, understanding genuinely the significant financial implications this situation carried for the broader family, while also maintaining clarity regarding exactly what accountability I genuinely required before considering any resolution that would allow this transaction to proceed as originally planned. "I'm not trying to destroy this deal out of pure spite," I told them clearly. "But I need you to understand that you can't simply erase my role in this company's success, and then expect me to quietly accept whatever terms you decide are convenient once your own decision creates a problem for you." I laid out specific terms I would require before considering renewal of the patent licensing agreement. Formal public acknowledgement of my role as the technology's original inventor within the acquisition's official documentation, a substantially revised personal compensation package reflecting my actual contribution rather than whatever reduced amount they'd apparently originally allocated me, and a formal, binding agreement establishing my continued involvement in any future technology development the acquiring company pursued using the underlying architecture I'd created. My father and Thatcher initially resisted these specific terms, particularly the compensation revision, understanding it would meaningfully reduce their own personal proceeds from the overall transaction. But faced with the genuine possibility of the entire deal collapsing given the acquiring company's own legal concerns regarding patent security, they ultimately recognized they held considerably less leverage in this particular negotiation than they'd originally, carelessly assumed when they'd first decided to exclude me entirely. I worked directly with Corinne and the acquiring company's own legal team over the following weeks to formally renegotiate both the patent licensing terms and my own compensation package, a process that ultimately secured me considerably more favorable terms than whatever my father and Thatcher had originally, quietly allocated me throughout their initial exclusionary negotiation process. The final agreement included formal recognition of my role as the technology's original inventor, a compensation package reflecting genuine, proportional value for my actual contribution to the company's success, and a formal consulting arrangement ensuring my continued involvement in future technology development, terms that represented genuine, meaningful accountability rather than simply an emotional confrontation, without lasting practical consequence. The acquisition ultimately closed roughly 6 weeks later than originally planned. My father and Thatcher's own personal proceeds reduced somewhat given my successfully renegotiated compensation, a financial consequence I recognized clearly reflected appropriate correction rather than any excessive, purely punitive outcome given everything that had actually transpired throughout their original, calculated exclusion. My relationship with my father and Thatcher remained genuinely strained throughout the following months, our interactions considerably more formal and careful than the closeness we'd once maintained throughout years of building the company together before that devastating exclusion revealed exactly how conditionally they'd apparently valued my actual contribution. My father eventually offered a more genuine acknowledgement during a private conversation, roughly 4 months after the acquisition finally closed. "I think Thatcher and I convinced ourselves that keeping you out of the negotiations was simply practical business strategy," he admitted. "But I understand now that it was really about not fully valuing your role, the way we should have all along." I appreciated this acknowledgement, though I maintained realistic expectations regarding how thoroughly it might genuinely reshape our relationship going forward, understanding that rebuilding authentic trust would require considerably more than a single conversation following consequences that had directly, significantly affected their own financial outcomes. Standing in my own new research lab roughly a year after that devastating original phone call, funded partly through my renegotiated compensation and partly through my new consulting arrangement with the acquiring company, I thought often about that specific moment. My father's clipped, formal voice informed me I was no longer welcome within the company and family legacy I genuinely helped build. I'd learned, throughout that entire difficult process, something genuinely important about ensuring my own contributions remained properly protected and recognized, understanding that genuine value, however significant, requires deliberate protection rather than simply trusting that others will naturally recognize and honor it appropriately without any formal, enforceable structure ensuring that recognition. I don't regret exercising the leverage those retained patents ultimately provided, understanding clearly that my family's calculated attempt to erase my role entirely required genuine, meaningful correction rather than quiet, uncomplaining acceptance of whatever diminished position they'd apparently decided I deserved once $80 billion made my actual inclusion feel inconvenient to their own preferred process.